The law. And this message is actually based on a very familiar passage, which is the Ten Commandments. I think most of you, all of you, know the Ten Commandments. But before I begin, I'm going to ask you guys, like I always do, a question that goes like this. It says, the question I have for you is, now that you are a Christian, how are you supposed to relate with God's law? Now that you are a Christian, how are you supposed to relate with God's law? In Exodus chapter 20, 1 through 20 reads this. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or on the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or his Tesla, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When the Lord saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and the sound of the mountains and the smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance, and Moses said, speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning. And all God's people said, Amen. So, growing up during my teenage years in high school and into college, and I became a Christian in high school, I was actually a pretty new Christian. And I had a very, what I call a tumultuous relationship with the law, God's law. And to be honest with you, I did not really figure out how I should relate to God's law until I reached my early 40s. Ever since I was in my teenage years, I struggled with the question, if the gospel is true, and if the law of God is good, how am I supposed to relate to this law of God? In other words, if Jesus fulfilled the requirements of the law on my behalf, what do I do now with God's law? Do I now just simply ignore it? At first, I simply tried to actually obey it. I tried to do everything. I tried to follow all the do-nots and do's of the law. Do this, but don't do that. Don't do that, but do this. And at first, I became legalistic. I became so prideful because I was getting my life in order. When you become a new Christian, becoming prideful and judgmental often happens to new Christians. And the reason is because I started to realize that when you become a new Christian, your life becomes more ordered. You kind of become out of this, chaos in your life, and you become more ordered internally and externally. And so you actually expect that from other people. And this certainly happened to me as a Christian. When I became a new Christian, I started to see the other people and started to be a little bit more judgmental. But over time, I came to realize for myself that law following is so exhausting. Law following is so exhausting. You see, at the time, I really wanted to be a good Christian. However, the law of God really began to bog me down. I felt like the law was like this heavy stone on my back, and I could not relinquish it. For those of you who have actually seen the play or seen the movie Les Miserables, I felt like Jean Valjean in that movie or that story, trying to shake the policeman Javert off his back. He's that policeman who represents the law in that story, if you remember. And because legalistic law-keeping was so burdensome, I slowly realized that law-keeping was not the answer. I realized also that Jesus, Jesus was not a legalistic lawkeeper. So I took another approach. The second approach I took with the law was I changed law keeping in my mind to that of good keeping. Good keeping. So I told you, wanted to be good as a Christian, especially when I was in college. And I figured out that there was just good ways to live a Christian life. And that I would just have to adhere to these kind of good keeping type of titles and good keeping type of tasks that would show up in my Christian life, such as being a good keeping church member, being a good small group leader in college, being a good missionary when I was living in China, being a good husband in marriage, being a good father to my children, being a good son to my parents, being a good employee in my company, being a good shepherd in my ministry, and being a good servant to those around me. But, yet again, over the years of trying to be good in all these areas, I found that good keeping was just as equally exhausting as law keeping. By the way, can any of you guys relate to me in this? Good keeping is equally exhausting as law keeping. Do you ever get tired of good keeping? I quickly realized that with my good keeping, that I could not measure up, and also realized that people have different definitions of good. So when other people actually told me that I was not so good, I would instantly get offended. And because I very often wanted to give up, I realized that I could never be a good enough Christian. And I said to myself, what's the point in trying? And this law of God, this good law of God, would continually lead me to struggle understanding God's goodness, because it seemed to me that his goodness was still somehow tied by my keeping to his law. So for years, I wrestled with this question. Now that I'm a Christian, how am I supposed to relate with God's law? Well, it wasn't until I got to my early 40s when God's law became much clearer to me. I came to realize that God's law means much more than trying to be a good Christian. And I came to realize that the law God represents, or this law that God gave us, represents actually something that's very, very crucial to all Christians. And what I learned was that God's law represented love. God's law represented love. And we know this from Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. It says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and every other command there might be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." And from this passage, I realized that there is a reality with love and God's law that actually you and I really need to pay attention to in our Christian lives. I realized that there was a basic principle at work with God's law, in that if you focus on love, you always get good. But if you focus on good, you might not find love. If you focus on love, you always get good. But if you focus on good, you might not find love. This is actually what happened to the Pharisees. They focused on good, and they missed out on love. And in fact, this is what often happens to us Christians all the time, every single one of us. Our Christian minds often revert to good over love. Yesterday, I was driving my son somewhere, and I asked him the question, "Why did God give us the 10 Commandments, Eli?" And he said to me, "To show us how to be good." To show us how to be good. You see, we often think this way with the law of God. Well, I think I understand and I figured out why the law seems like good keeping rather than love. I think I figured this out, and I think that the reason is because of the ancient people back in the days of the Old Testament. They used different words to describe love back then as you read God's law. And God's law actually doesn't seem like love to us modern readers, especially if you read the book of Leviticus. All of you have read that book. And I'm actually becoming more convinced these days that if you and I can know how the ancient people loved and they experienced love, then you can understand the law of God. In fact, there are actually 3 words that the ancient people had in mind to describe love. And believe it or not, these 3 words are actually very, very applicable to our modern day relationships with God and with other people as well. We actually just don't use these words in our modern day vocabulary very much. But it so happens that these 3 words are used together in my all-time favorite movie. You guys know this movie? A Few Good Men. This is a great movie. By the way, how many of you have seen this movie? Of my generation? All right, we've got some people who have seen this movie. How many of you have not seen this movie? A lot of you haven't. You have to. My gosh. Just dig my grave outside the back of the church. I'm about to die. I'm becoming so old. This movie, A Few Good Men, came out in 1992. Jack Havman, how old were you in 1992? Were you born? You're a negative life, right? How many years negative? Huh? 8? 11 years negative. I just want a small plot of land out there and just dig my grave out there, okay? Okay, so this movie came out in 1992, and this movie starred a young Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. And by the way, Tom Cruise, who is now 60 years old, was actually 30 years old when he filmed this movie. Well, around the time I graduated from college in 1997, you were a negative 8 at that time. The movie was released on DVD, and I could not get enough of this movie. And the reason why I could not get enough of this movie, for those of you who haven't seen this movie, is because this movie to me was probably one of the greatest courtroom movies of my generation. This movie is about a story about a man named Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee, played by Tom Cruise, who's this military lawyer defending 2 Marines who are charged with killing another Marine. 2 Marines are charged with killing another Marine. His name is Private Santiago at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. And Daniel Kaffee is this U.S. Marine lawyer who's known for always taking the easy way out. He always goes and seeks out a plea bargain. And so he does that for all his legal cases. But one day, Lieutenant Commander Joanne Galloway, played by Demi Moore, convinces Kaffee that these two accused men or Marines, were most likely carrying out an order from their commanding officer, their commanding officer to actually kill Private Santiago. In other words, these 2 Marines killed Private Santiago not based on their own motivation, but on the motivation of a superior officer who's the colonel of Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. And as you can imagine, this whole movie is this buildup of how Daniel Kaffee, again, who's always known to take the easy way out by taking plea bargains, he's actually taken this huge, huge risk calling Colonel Nathan R. Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson, to the stand in the courtroom in order to really uncover and attempt to uncover this conspiracy. And this movie is such an awesome movie. If you are in college, you have to go see this movie. And for those of you in my generation who have seen this movie, you all probably remember this scene. You probably remember this scene. In this scene, Lieutenant Kaffee calls Colonel Jessup to the stand and point blank asks Colonel. He says, "Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red? Did you order the killing of that Marine, Private Santiago?" And the judge says, "You don't have to answer that question, Colonel." And Colonel Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson, says, "I'll answer the question." "You want answers?" And Kaffee says, "I think I'm entitled to them." He says, "You want answers? I want the truth." You guys remember that scene? "I want the truth." "You can't handle the truth." And Colonel Jessup gives this amazing speech. He says, "Son, I've got a greater responsibility than you can possibly imagine. You weep for Santiago and to curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have that luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, though grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. Use them as a punchline. I neither have the time nor the inclination to explain myself to someone who rises and sleeps under the very blanket of freedom I provide and then questions the means in which it's provided. I'd rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Or I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a rainbow. He didn't say rainbow. What you think you're entitled to. And Kathy says, did you order the code red? And then you have to watch the rest of the movie to see what happens. Thank you. I'm sorry that I had to do that to you guys. I've been memorizing that speech since I was 26 years old. I've never forgotten that speech throughout my whole life. I should have been memorizing the Bible. I should have been doing the 8-day accumulations at 26 years old, but I was memorizing that speech. But what's amazing about that speech is I've never forgotten the line from my all-time favorite line from Colonel Jessup in that speech. He says, we use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You see, these three words, honor, code, loyalty, these three words sums up actually what God is actually doing in the story of the Exodus with the Israelites, with the law, actually. And these three words, honor, code, loyalty, they're actually crucial. They're crucial to helping you and I understand how we relate to God's law via love. Via love. But again, for us modern readers, honor, code, loyalty, it doesn't give us the impression of love. And it actually can give the impression of the military, just like this movie, A Few Good Men. And the reason why is that God's law is so confusing to many of us Christians today is we don't see how the ancient people saw honor, code, and loyalty. So this morning, I want to unpack these three words for you. Honor, code, loyalty, from the Ten Commandments. And I place these actually in your notes for you to follow along with me as we progress this morning. And the first thing that I think will help you really, really understand with God's law, if you are a Christian, is number one. Number one, God's law represents honor. God's law represents honor. And we need to be people who honor God and honor others. Now, the reason why honor is loving is because honor prioritizes relationships rightly. Honor prioritizes relationships rightly. And we know this because this comes directly from the scriptures here in the Exodus chapter 20 in the Ten Commandments. In verse 3 and 4 it says, you shall not have other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or the earth beneath or in the water below. You see, in verse 3, when God says that you shall have no other gods before me, what he's really saying is that you and I should prioritize your relationship with God first. Prioritize your relationship with him first. You know, I've actually come to the realization that prioritization directly deals with our hearts. It really does. Prioritization really deals with our hearts. And I think that you would agree with me in that the things that we prioritize in our life, we prioritize things that we really value in our heart. Jesus says this. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And what God is actually asking his people is that you and I prioritize him over the tempting things that we can actually be devoted to in this world. What are you really devoted to? What are you devoted to? You know, before we became believers, we were devoted to all kinds of things around us. But God's law asks you to be devoted to him. And the question is always why? Why? Why are we supposed to prioritize God? Is it because God deserves to be prioritized over everything simply because he's God and the creator? And I think the answer is yeah, partially. Partially yes. Partially. But I also think the other part of the reason why you and I are to prioritize God is because God prioritized you. God prioritized you. This is the reason. Actually, it says in Exodus 19, many people don't know this. Listen to what God says in Exodus 19, 4 through 6. This is right when the Israelites have been rescued by God and they've gone through the Red Sea. Exodus 19, by the way, is one chapter before the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And here's what the Lord God says. He says, you yourself have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully, and if you keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. You will be my treasured possession. And I love this part. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Now this phrase, you will be my treasured possession, has a lot more meaning than we might think it does. This word, that treasured possession, in Hebrew means segula, or is the word segula. And this word segula appears 8 times in the Old Testament. But this word in Hebrew, the Hebrew Old Testament, also in other writings as well, is referred to someone who enjoys a special status. That's what it means. You are my treasured possession. You enjoy a special status. So not only were the Israelites saved from Egypt, but they were given special status by God to be his. This is what love is, by the way, in the ancient world. God giving us special status, a status of honor, because we are prioritized as his. In fact, do you know what this image should make you think about when you think about this Ten Commandments? You should have the image of marriage. You should think about marriage. And this might sound strange to many of you modern married people today. It's because, us modern people who are married, we get married to seek happiness, don't we? We get married in order to be happy. 2 people looking to have happy lives. 2.5 kids, a house, a dog named Lucky, you know what I'm saying? And this is why many modern people are disappointed with marriage, actually. And there's a funny story about a woman who was seeking a divorce from her husband, and she comes to her pastor, and she said to her pastor, the reason why she wanted a divorce, she said, when I got married, I was looking for the ideal. Instead, it became an ordeal. And now I'm looking for a new deal. That's exactly our attitude with marriage these days, right? However, in the olden days of ancient times, marriage served primarily as the means of elevating status with kings, with nobles, and members of the ruling class, marrying into, their daughters to form alliances, to gain land, to acquire land, and to produce legitimate heirs. And in fact, the story of God and the Israelites is not 2 common people getting married together like we might think. It's really a story about Prince William's and Kate Middleton. Y'all know Kate Middleton, right? She's now the Princess of Wales. But did you guys know what her parents actually did for their occupation? They worked as flight attendants for British Airways. And actually, her parents met while serving on the same flight together, if you can believe that or not. And so Kate Middleton, she grew up in a regular, common household. But when she met Prince Williams at St. Andrew's College in Scotland, and they got married in April of 2011, right when she got married, her status was elevated. They immediately gave her the honored title, the Duchess of Cambridge. And then now she's the Princess of Wales. And so what you all need to know when you read the story of the Exodus in chapter 19, when God spoke the words to the Israelites that they were his treasured possession, God, the husband, was about to invite all the Israelites to come up to the top of the mountain to meet God there. God was actually planning for an organized wedding, if you will. He was going to encourage all of them. By the way, you should read Exodus 19 when you go home. It's awesome. He was going to encourage all the Israelites to come to the top of the mountain. And on the 3rd day, God speaks to them these words. He speaks the 10 Commandments. He says to them, and he gives them this covenant of marriage. He tells them, he says to them, prioritize me above all other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. In other words, be married, be devoted, and connected to me only, and not other gods. And the reason why in chapter 19, verse 16, on the 3rd day, there's like all these peals of lightning, and there's smoke, and all the Israelites are scared to go to the top of the mountain, was because God wanted to show the seriousness of this marriage covenant. He didn't want them to take it lightly. Moses even says to the people, do not be afraid. He says, do not be afraid, believe it or not. Don't be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will keep you from sinning. In other words, don't be devoted to other gods with a small g. It's going to have consequences for your life. Don't have idols. However, after God spoke the 10 Commandments, you know this, the Israelites were scared and said, we don't want to hear from him anymore. We just want to hear from you, Moses. Let God speak to you. But had the Israelites gone to the top of that mountain, who knows what would have happened? Who knows? They might have been given life 2.0 bodies. They could have had resurrected bodies maybe. Maybe their face would have lighted up like Moses when he went to the top of the mountain and God passed by, right? And showed them his glory. But just like Adam and Eve, they forfeited their opportunity to meet with God. And so do we. We forfeit our opportunity to meet with God. So brothers and sisters in Christ, do you know that through Jesus, you are prioritized as his? You're prioritized as his. And did you know that you are his treasured possession and you've been given special status and his heart is actually with you? And do you know that this special status is a special status of honor? You have been given honor. God even says, although the world is mine, I have chosen you. And do you see that your relationship to God is a relationship of marriage? Do you feel like you're really married to God? That's the question. The Apostle Paul says that we are the bride of Christ and that we are raised in honor with him. So the question is, since God and Jesus has prioritized you, are you going to prioritize him? This is the question. And what this means is to honor God. It is an honoring of God as in marriage, and therefore this is love. This is love to the ancient people. So as we continue with the 10 Commandments from verse 3, you'll see it says in verse 4, you shall have no other gods before me. And in verse 4 it says, you shall not make for yourself an image in any form. And the reason is because you and I are actually his image, right? According to Genesis chapter 1. We were meant to be the ones who reflect God to the world. So this brings us to the next word in this covenant. The next word is code. You see, the observation of God's law is that the law is a covenant code of trust. The law is a covenant code of trust. It shows you how to reflect the image of God to your non-Christian friends around you. Let's look at verse 7. It says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. If you go and actually read the NASB, and if you go and read the ESV, it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes the name of the Lord your God. And you know, a lot of people think that this verse 7, a lot of people says they think it's not using God's name with foul language, like cussing or cursing, you know. What many people don't know is that this actual word in Hebrew, translated as misuse or take in our English Bible, is the word nasa, which is actually spelled as NASA, like the space station NASA. And what it means is to carry or to lift up. Lift up. And so the only other place in the story of the Exodus where the word nasa is used is when the biblical authors are describing this plate that he's wearing, which has the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this high priest would carry the plates and this plate with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel into God's presence. And so what verse 7, along with verse 4, means is that the Israelites, and now you and me, we are to carry God's name in such a way that brings honor to his name. And that you and I are to remember that we are the image of God and not idols, not idols. We are the Kate Middletons, if you will. We are the ones who are originally regular people, normal people, but now we are part of the royal family because we've been raised, we've been lifted up in the honor of the Lord's name. You know, a name is so important to us, especially brand names. My daughter Gracie, she came home from school like last semester, and she came home singing this song that she learned from gym class. She started singing, I got my Gucci's on, I got my Louis Vuitton. And then she's actually really good at singing now. She can do the ow, ow sounds in the song, ow, And I looked, I don't know how she's learned that though. I looked up the rest of this lyrics, right? This lyrics is from that song, Made You Look by Meghan Trainor. And this song is actually, quite interestingly, it's a song about making her own husband look at her without being decked out with all these brand name clothes, that her husband is just attracted to her by just wearing pajama pants and wearing a hoodie over her, over her head or her body, right? Not wearing all these brand names like Louis Vuitton and Gucci and all that. And so names, if you think about it, in our day and age, names, they are so important to us. They have some kind of status. It's because when you carry a name, you're carrying some level of honor. You're carrying honor. Carrying that name. And this is why, actually, the disciples, if you look at Jesus and the disciples, they wanted to accept non-Christians into the fold, into the Jewish people. And the reason why is because they wanted the non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, to carry God's name. If you look in Acts chapter 15, verses 13 through 18, it says, when they finished, James spoke up and says, brothers, he said, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. And the word of the prophets are in agreement with this, as is written, after this I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild, I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord. Who does these things? Things known from long ago. So this is the reason why God's law is a covenant code. Resting on the Sabbath, honoring your father and mother, not murdering, not committing adultery, not stealing, are ways that you and I are carrying or bearing God's name into the world. And there's much more than just trying to be a morally upright person with this code. You see, resting on the Sabbath has a deeper meaning. It means that we are people who trust God, the Creator, that He will provide for us. It's a trust. Trusting is love, by the way. Honoring your father and mother means that you are people who submit to authority. Submitting is a form of love. Not murdering is treating other people as the image of God. Seeing other people made in God's image is love. And not committing adultery or stealing or not, is not actually, when you don't do those things, you're not breaking people's trust. And again, trust is love. Very often, we modern Christians, we think about carrying God's name via love as just kind of being someone who's nice and who's warm and friendly, And while I do think Jesus was nice and he was warm and he was friendly the majority of the time, I also believe via the Ten Commandments that God wants more from you and me than just being nice, warm, and friendly. He wants us to carry his name into the world. And I believe that he is actually calling you and me to be people of trust, people who submit, and people who value other people. And this brings honor because God is love. God is love. This is what it means to love people. Are you a person that people trust? Are you a person that people trust? Are you a person who submits to other people, who honors other people? Are you a person who values other people, even your enemies, as valuables? You know why looking at your enemies is loving, is why Jesus calls us to do that? It's because they are made in the image of God, even though they are your enemy, right? And so that's why he says to love your enemies. It's because valuing other people, even though they are your enemy, they're made in God's image, and we're supposed to love them. And this is why love is a covenant code. And this leads me to my last word describing the Ten Commandments, and we're almost done. God's law represents loyalty. God's law represents loyalty expressed as enduring commitment of hesed. God's law represents loyalty expressed as enduring commitment or hesed. God's expectation is loyalty from you to him and to other people as well. So just to tell you a story, over this past 4th of July weekend, I went to a Chon family reunion in Portland, Oregon. Rob, where were you? I was at a Chon. Just kidding. Rob is a Chon. but he didn't come. We had over 40 Chon family members gathered there, including our kids. And the reason why our family is so big is because my father there, I don't know if you guys can see him. It's kind of hard for to see because of the lighting. He's in the middle there. He had 5 siblings, an older sister, 2 younger brothers, and a youngest sister in the family. And so my father and his 5 siblings were actually all pretty much there except the oldest sister. We're all there with all the family members. And my father and his 5 siblings were actually born in Pyongyang, North Korea. My father is 82 years old. He's the middle of the 2 brothers that have white hair there. Well, my father, leading up to this reunion, he actually made a small book for us as a family. And he gave them out to all the 40 family members. And in this book, which is about 80 pages or so long, he told the story of how he and his family walked from North Korea down to South Korea by foot during the Korean War. They were actually not planning to walk down to South Korea. They were actually initially on a train, but the family, as they were sitting on this open kind of train, cargo train, this freight train, with tons of other people just hanging on for dear life, waiting to go from north to south, the train didn't move. And so because they were all very hungry, they were waiting for hours upon hours on this train, they were actually looking at other people, and they were jumping off the train trying to get food. And they asked them, "Where are you going?" And they said, "Oh, we're going to get food. We heard that the train is going to leave tomorrow." So my family thought, "Oh, we'll just go and jump off the train, get some food at a nearby village, and come back to the train." And so as they get off the train, they went to get food, they ate there, and they came back. And as they're coming back, the train is taking off. And then that led them for a 2-year journey by foot to walk down to the South Korea. This train was a huge kind of, misfortune for my family, if you will. And my dad, he titled this little book, he called it The Wartime Memory of My Mother, because my grandmother, this story is really a story about my grandmother, who was actually the Moses figure leading the Exodus from north to south. And my grandfather, due to safety reasons, it wasn't safe for the dads to travel with the family because they would think that they're spies and whatnot. So the grandfather had to go first, and then the grandmother had to take the 5 siblings down to the south. And my grandmother, who's in this picture, my grandmother was 33 years old. And my aunt the oldest sister was age 15. My father was age 12, and his 2 younger brothers was age 9 and 7. And the youngest sister here was age 4. That's the youngest sister. And they were, this is actually just an amazing story if you read the book. My family went through all sorts of stuff. My dad was shot at by planes, bombs being dropped on them, seeing dead bodies across the road. But there's a couple of stories in that book that illustrates the heart of God and the law. And there's a story that illustrates really how tough my grandmother was. It's a story about how my grandmother and the family, they made it all the way down. I don't know if you can see that at the map. At the end of that, from the red down to the bottom, is a place called Sariwon. Sariwon's North Korea. And they were living there on a rice field for about almost a year or so. And my grandmother, she knows that in order to make it all the way down south to cross the 38th parallel, she knows that she's running out of money. And that she has to actually go back up to Pyongyang because she's hidden some jewelry in her house. And so she decides the family's in Sariwon down there. She decides that in order to make it across to South Korea, she's going to go by herself all the way up to Pyongyang by herself to grab that little bag that she had of jewelry so she can actually sell it to make it down to the south. And so she actually walks by herself 40 miles from Sariwon all the way up to Pyongyang. And she grabs that jewelry and she heads back. So it's an 80-mile round trip during the Korean War, if you can imagine. That's how tough as nails she was. And this jewelry was enough money for them to actually go down to the south because it helped them make this deal with this guy who had this spy boat. He was taking spies across from North to South Korea, who was South Korean spies. And my grandmother, she heard this rumor that there are spy boats at Kyodong Island. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names. Kyodong Island off of the Yellow Sea. And they're going to take these Korean spies down to the south. And so my grandmother, she has this determination that she's going to catch one of these spy boats with the 5 children, if you will. And so she takes the 5 children and she takes them out to the Yellow Sea. And you have to take them out when the tide is out. Because if the tide is in, you can't go, right? And and when you're walking out in the tide, you're walking and you're trudging through thick, thick mud. And if you stop, the mud will make you sink. And so she takes the family out to catch this spy boat, not knowing if this spy boat is actually there. And my dad, he's walking, and he sees all these dead bodies floating in the water because the tide had rushed back in. That's how fast the tide would come back. And the family, as they're walking in such thick mud, my grandmother, she's holding the youngest aunt, 4 years old, on her back. And she starts to sink into the mud. And she's halfway sunken into the mud. And it's pitch dark because they had to go in the pitch dark of night because there's soldiers up on the top of the canyon, I guess the cliffs, and they're shooting at defectors as well as spies that they think are coming in. And so they had to go through night so no one could see them, and they had to be very quiet. So my grandmother, she gets stuck in mud with my aunt on the back, who's 4 years old, and she just starts screaming, "Help me! Help me! Help me!" And thank God, because one of the spy boat guides was there in the boat. He hears her, and he comes out and he grabs her. He takes his belt and he wraps it around her body and pulls her body out of the thick mud. And he grabs my 4-year-old aunt at the time. And so she's light enough to make it to the spy boat, and they head all the way down to the south, and they actually made it. And so when they got to the south, all the officers like, "How did you guys do it?" Because nobody in their right mind would take their family with 5 kids to catch a spy boat. This had never happened before, right? But this is how tough my grandmother really was. And I realized at this reunion, after reading this part of the book, it dawned on me that, none of us Chons, except Rod would be there, none of us Chons would be surviving because of unless it was for my grandmother who actually saved the family and rescued us to the south. We would not exist, most likely. But, there is one sad story that happens at the end. She makes it down to South Korea, and she went immediately looking for my grandfather, right? And my grandfather, who had, again, he left the family early because it's dangerous to travel with the family. She went looking for my granddad, and my grandmother was warned that he actually might be remarried. Because back then, a lot of single men would travel down to the south, and after about a year waiting for their families, they would actually get remarried to another wife because they needed someone to help cook for them and all these type of things to help support them. Korean men didn't cook back then. They still don't cook today, I don't think. So, but my grandfather waited 2 years. He actually waited for them for 2 years, waiting for them to come down. But after waiting 2 years, I guess he couldn't wait anymore. I guess he couldn't cook for himself. So he decided, hey, maybe they're not going to make it. And maybe I should actually ask get remarried again so I could actually start a new life over again. But right before he's about to get remarried, guess who shows up? My grandmother. This is what you call a Korean drama, right? You can totally see this in a Korean drama. They're about to get married and the grandmother shows up, Wah! But can you imagine how disappointed my grandmother was when she saw, even though he waited for 2 years. Most men waited 1 year, but he waited 2 years. Even though, he waited 2 years, my grandmother was very disappointed. She was saddened. Because she felt like because of her absolute loyalty to the family, risking her life to bring the whole family down, she was expecting absolute loyalty from my grandfather. She thought to herself, it doesn't matter if you waited 1 or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. I was expecting you to wait for me forever, in a sense. That expectation of loyalty, that expectation is the same expectation of loyalty that comes from our God. Our God expects loyalty from all of us. He expects all of us to be 100% loyal to him. And the reason why God gave us the 10 Commandments is for loyalty. The 10 Commandments is a marriage covenant for loyalty. It's not a law for good keeping. It's a loyalty covenant, not a good keeping covenant. And if you can understand loyalty in this covenant code, then you can understand the last commandments that says, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey or Tesla or anything belongs to your neighbor, right? And the reason why this phrase, your neighbor, keeps on being repeated at the end of the 10 Commandments is just to expose our heart of loyalty to our neighbor, to one another. Loyalty equals love in the ancient world. Loyalty equals love. And it's still the case today, believe it or not. But unfortunately, in our world, especially in our Western world, you and I view things through this lens of right and wrong. We view things from the lens of good and bad, our own rights when it comes to our neighbor, and even God. And in the U.S., we will sue our neighbor if we have to over right and wrong. You will divorce your neighbor if you have to over good and bad. But what the law of God is really driving at is having a heart of loyalty to our neighbor and to God. It says in Exodus chapter 20, verses 5 to 6, we know that God is asking for loyalty because it says this: "You shall not bow down to them and worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love," or hesed. Hesed means affection, generosity, and enduring commitment to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You guys know in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. But when people actually confessed with their mouth that Jesus is Lord in the days of Paul, it was a big deal. And the reason why it was a big deal is because it was a matter of loyalty. It was a matter of loyalty. Are you loyal to the Lord Jesus, or are you loyal to Caesar? And if you're loyal to the Lord Jesus over Caesar, it could cost you your life. That's what it meant. And God's expectation is no different today. When you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, it's not just like, I accepted him as Lord and you check the box and like, I'm a Christian. It's you're loyal to him now. You're married to him. Now it's through Jesus, through the new covenant of his blood and of the bread, his body. It's no different today. Embedded in the law is this expectation of a heart of loyalty. Are you loyal? Are you loyal to God? That's the question. Well, in conclusion, I hope that when you read the Ten Commandments and you meditate on the Ten Commandments on your own, you will see love as honor, as code, as loyalty. Honor, code, and loyalty. And it's no different. And hopefully, you can understand why Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 20. He says this, and I think I placed these in your notes. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. You see, there's only one way to surpass the Pharisees' righteousness, by fulfilling the law, and that is by love. That's the only way, by love. If you focus on love, you will always get good. But if you focus on good, you might not find love.